Howdy-ho everyone, I am Nathan Blake, and welcome to a little rant that I want to do. This is completely unscripted, just wanted to talk for a minute. I've been watching different videos recently about different older games and comparing them and things like that, as well as just watching playthroughs of older games and things like that. And the comparison that always gets made, the comparison that always fought is which was the best game on the Nintendo 64. And one of the main things that the discussion always is Ocarina of Time better than Mario 64? Now, if you look at the top 3 most famous video game characters of all time, you will see that it is Mario, then Link, then Master Chief from the Halo series. So what we're talking about here is the 2 most iconic video game characters of all time competing for the position of number 1. And what you're doing whenever you look at the N64 is you're looking at what was their debut into 3D and what did it change? What did it personify whenever they became 3D games, right? So a lot of people look at these as the time when gaming came into 3D for its first real time. Yes, 3D had existed before, but everyone's attempts before these 2 games were half shots. They were half-baked attempts. None of them actually lived up to either of these 2 titles, Mario 64 and The Legend of Zelda: The Ocarina of Time. Whenever you look at Mario 64, you see the first time that a fully realized 3D platformer ever really existed. Now, obviously, there were other attempts, and there was 2.5 attempts, and all these different things, but Mario is the one who personified the new 3D world. It's incredibly interesting that the launch title for this console, for the N64, is thought of by, I would say, the majority of people to be the best game on the console. Now, the question for that is why? Why is it thought of as the best? And I would say, objectively, that more people believe it's the best than believe Ocarina of Time is the best. And we'll get to why that is here in a minute, and why people are actually kind of conflicted on Ocarina of Time being the best. But whenever we look at why people generally say that Mario 64 is the best game on the N64, and why it's one of the best Mario games, I believe that one of the biggest parts that is playing into that is that it was the first time we saw Mario fully realized in 3D, and in doing so, it was the first time that you were able to jump and move and manipulate the world in a 3D way. In almost any reasonable fashion up to that point. No other attempts at 3D platforming even came close to the feel of Mario 64, with your ability to truly control where Mario's going and the button combinations that you could do, even with the N64 controller being what it was, to do different types of jumps, the triple jump, the long jump, the back flip, the ground pound, all of these things that became staples of platforming, 3D platforming, all found their origin in Mario 64. And these people, you're looking at the Mario games that came before it, and really there's only a core 4 that came before it, really, which was obviously Mario 1, Mario 2, Mario 3, Super Mario World, and Mario 64. Were there other Mario games? Yes, but when you're trying to come up with a comprehensive list of true Mario games, those 4 will be the 4 that you see before you see Mario 64. And what they had done is created the Mario formula. And once you get into the Mario formula, this is whenever you get to start talking about why I personally believe that Ocarina of Time is a better game and did more than Mario 64. And I know that can be controversial to say, and I know that some people will disagree with that, and I welcome discussion in the comments as long as it's civil, and I welcome a conversation between you and me and between each other. But basically what I'm getting at is that Mario 64 held true to the exact same formula that we saw in previous games. The only difference was that it was 3D. Now, did they do a great job of 3D? Obviously. They created the 3D platformer. Other games that tried to make 3D platformers just didn't do it as well. Even ones that came after it failed to make better or even as good 3D platformers. Now, one could definitely argue that games like Banjo-Kazooie or Donkey Kong 64 did just as well, or maybe even better in certain ways, but that's based on what they had learned from Mario 64. So getting back to what made Mario 64 an impressive game, it was simply that it was 3D. Look at the Mario formula, the way Mario games are made. If you boil them down to their core, what are they? They are man jumps on turtles. And that is what it is. If you boil it down as far as you can, it's man jumps on turtles. You could argue it's man jumps on mushrooms, because there's a lot of mushrooms, good and bad, in Mario games as well. But if, in its essence, it's about being Mario saving Princess Peach from Bowser, a formula that is so old that they have even started making fun of it themselves in their creations, then it's clear that you can't call it new or call it innovative in anything but its 3D landscape and its controls. Now, credit where credit's due. Obviously, Mario 64 did things amazingly. It did a great job being able to do the wall kicks, for instance, and bounce off of walls in order to get to higher areas. You know, the higher jumps, finding all of the secrets and switches and things like that are obviously all interesting things. But when you think about it, they hadn't done anything that a platformer hadn't done before. They just translated it very well into a 3D world, and really at the end of the day, they did almost nothing that they themselves hadn't done before. They just translated it very well into a 3D world. Now, you can talk about the fact that Mario is fighting different types of bad guys in this game, but really he's not for the most part. They're all 3D renderings of classic bad guys. And I think that that's a good thing, because we wanted to see these things in 3D. That was the appeal of 3D Mario, was seeing things that we were used to in the Mario world being 3D for the first time. Now, of course, we had some cool things, like flying Mario. Mario is suddenly able to fly for the first time in a 3D space, but has he flown in other games? Of course he has. Now, that means that the only thing that they innovated on, the only thing that actually has changed in the Mario formula between Super Mario World and Super Mario 64 is the space that it's played in and how they executed that space. Now, moving on to Zelda, I know that people have talked a lot about the formula of Zelda. I would like to point out that, first of all, at this point in Ocarina of Time, Zelda had only had a handful of iterations, and that they had tried different things along the way up to this point. We have Link's Adventure, which is a completely different type of game. They had tried all different types of things in the handheld games up to this point. There was a lot of really interesting things that Zelda was trying to do, and they were refining their formula. Now, of course, we all know that as you go forward in the Zelda timeline on to Twilight Princess and eventually Skyward Sword, people got tired of the Zelda formula. But what is the Zelda formula? Why is it that it was so successful even though it also followed a very specific formula? Well, what the Zelda formula is, it can't be boiled down near as much. I mean, it can be if you want to be really reductive and you want to say, boy goes on adventure to fight pig monster, and you can do that. You can compare apples to apples, or rather apples to oranges, in that way, and say Mario is man jumps on mushrooms and Zelda is boy goes on adventure fights pig monster. But what is the in-between parts of this adventure? Mario jumping on mushrooms, fights giant turtle, saves girl. That's it. He might punch some mushrooms, he might climb some things, and he might wall kick off of some things, and he might travel around in spaces. But at the end of the day, what else is there to Mario? There's vignette-style worlds where you get to venture around in different places, but every game ever has had that. So really you have to ask the question, what is it that makes Mario Mario? And at the end of the day, it is a man jumping around, and that is the fun of it. That's what we want from it, and that's why Mario is a good thing. That's why we enjoy it, and that's why the formula worked for so long. Man jumps around. But if we get down into what makes Zelda a Zelda game, and of course part of this is my own bias because I love Zelda games, but what makes it its own thing you can find in every Zelda game ever. You can find it in the first Zelda game, in that it was this huge open world adventure, and that you were seeing so many different things, and you were talking to so many different people. You were finding items that had unique uses. Now, of course, obviously, this formula is repeated in later on Zelda games, of course, but it was innovated on in new and interesting ways besides just being 3D. So Mario 64 is the exact same formula seen in every Mario game before, only in 3D. Now, what did they innovate on that formula? It's 3D. That's the only demonstrable difference, is it's now in 3D, which means Mario is jumping different directions than he was before, and he's climbing things in a Z-axis. But that's really the only difference. Now, if you look at Ocarina of Time, a lot of people have pointed out the similarities between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, and they even claim that A Link to the Past is a better game. I disagree entirely, and that's another discussion for another day, but personally, we have to look at, in my opinion, we have to look at what Ocarina of Time did differently from its predecessors and what concepts it created for the future. Well, it had 3D, which is the only comparable thing to what Mario did. It's 3D now, which means there's up and down, and there's left and right, and there's forward and backwards, and that's really cool, obviously. But how did it help to be 3D? What did that add to Zelda? Well, for Mario, it added the ability to now jump differently, but it was still jumping. In Zelda, it added the ability to adventure differently, but it was still adventuring. But what does adventuring entail? When you look at what an adventure game is, and an action-adventure RPG, which is what Ocarina of Time is, you see that you can't boil it down near as much, because if you say the word adventure, then that entails a certain connotation to it, that you're doing specific things, and those things are numerous. Whereas if you boil down what a platformer is, it has one meaning: you jump and maybe collect. But if you boil down what an adventure game is, you get story, you get interaction with other characters, you get puzzles, you get all of these different items that are being used in different ways. And when you think about it that way, Ocarina of Time has way more to offer. Now, some people don't like what it has to offer, but if we're speaking objectively, it is less repetitive and does way more. It is very easy to make man jump in game. Look at all of the consoles during the SNES time period in the 90s. A lot of people made games about man jumps. Not near as many people made any worthwhile games that were story-driven narratives about adventuring around and interacting with other characters and having all of these items that work in different ways. Were there plenty of people that attempted such a thing? Of course there were. There's always copycats, but there was a reason why so many people attempted platformers for so long. It's because it's easy to repeat. Now, of course, Mario is the best one, and that's why it always rose to the top. That's why it's the most memorable one, is because it's best. But all it would have taken was for somebody else to innovate a tiny bit, and they would have made a very comparable or even superior platformer. But in that day and age, it was impossible really to make a superior adventure game to Ocarina of Time, because Ocarina of Time was the only only thing out there that was doing anything on that scope. It was the Skyrim of the day. It was this huge open world, and yes, was it linear? Yes, of course. And did you have to do certain quests in certain orders? Obviously. But you had this giant world. This world that you were moving around and communicating with different people, and each person had unique personality traits and he had unique things about them. And obviously some of them, it was as simple as a thing as, hey, look up here, press Z to look at me, and they were pretty much tutorial pieces. But what did Mario have to offer in that area? Question mark boxes, I guess? That's pretty much it. When comparing these two games, it's very difficult because it is apples to oranges. It's impossible to say which is better because preference plays such a large role in it. But whenever you talk about what type of work had to go into it, and what amount of effort had to happen there, and how it innovated in new ways, Ocarina of Time comes out on top. It has to, because whereas the new mechanics in Super Mario 64 were punching and kicking Mario, the new mechanics in Ocarina of Time versus A Link to the Past was first-person bow shooting, it was horse riding, it was Z targeting, which created targeting in action adventure RPG games. It was the first game really to come up with a decent way of dueling with somebody in a 3D space. It had all of these different characters who were unique and had personalities and who were interested in different things and different people, mostly Link, even though he was a little kid sometimes, which was kind of weird. It's just so clear that there is more that goes into every single item in Ocarina of Time than there was that went into each move type in Super Mario 64. If you look at Mario 64, jumping is the main mechanic, and therefore there are lots of unique ways to use that jumping, but at the end of the day, you're going to be trying to get from point A to point B by jumping and kicking. Whenever you look at Ocarina of Time, any problem that you face could be solved with a number of items. Now, of course, there's one item that they've designed to solve it, usually the one from the temple, but that's because it was harkening back to its roots, which was adventure games in general, where they gave you an item like a match, and you walk into a room and there's a candlestick, and you type in light candle with match, and it says, what candle? And you say, light candlestick with match, and it's like, what kind of stick are you talking about? And you're like, but it's harkening back to that sort of thing, but those items still maintain some importance later on in the game. Even items like the Megaton Hammer, which you found early on and used in one of the first adult temples, was necessary at the end of the game whenever you didn't have the Master Sword, if you didn't have the Big Goron Sword, but that's a different story. Even your bow is used repeatedly throughout the game to solve different types of puzzles, and you're given new things that augment that. When you think about all of your upgrades being augmentations on things that you had before, as opposed to a one-off item that you never needed, you start realizing that the weapons and items in Ocarina of Time had a lot of depth. Because what we like to do is say, well, you get the bow in the first temple, and then you pretty much never use it again. And then later on in the ice temple, you get the ice arrow, and then you use that for that one place, and then you never really use it again, or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, those are upgrades for your bow. Your bow is always used. Your bow is always necessary. From the very first moment in the game, when you get your slingshot, you are learning and honing the ability of shooting something in that fashion. Your slingshot upgrades into a bow, and it has a different attack amount, it has a different use and feel to it, and then that upgrades to the fire arrow, and then that upgrades to the ice arrow, and then that upgrades to the light arrow. So it's one item that is being innovated on throughout the entire game so that it can be multi-purpose. It's one thing that is being used in 4 or 5 different ways in a completely unique manner. And don't even get me started on the fact that you can do things like shoot your arrow through fire to make it a fire arrow. There is so much depth to every single item that you get in the game. Bombs actually, your wrist thing that allows you to pick bomb plants becomes bombs, and your bombs become bombachus. And you're using those things all throughout the game, so it feels like they're different items that are only used occasionally. But at the end of the day, it is one item that is evolving over time, teaching you throughout the game. What do we have in Mario 64 that has this same thing? Jumping. That's it. The only thing that you evolve in as you play through Mario 64 is jumping. Now, is it true that there's a lot of depth to that jumping? Obviously, there is. Different people at different play levels can use jumping in different ways. But at the end of the day, the only thing that Nintendo did with Mario 64 was make jumping, which they had done before. So although we like to look back and think about how innovative they were in creating a 3D Mario game and how it was a completely different game than anything that came before, it is more formulaically similar to previous Mario games than Ocarina of Time is similar to previous Zelda games. And the reason that is because even though the Zelda games follow the formula of be Link, gather items, fight bosses, beat Ganon, everything in between is very unique. You have unique conversations you've never had before. You meet unique characters you've never met before. You get unique items you've never used before. Those items are used differently because they're in a 3D space. When you look at Mario, which can be boiled down to man jumps on mushrooms and turtles, man saves princess from Big Turtle, those things stay the same even in a 3D space. They are not played out any differently. You're still jumping, you're still fighting mushrooms, and you're still fighting turtles. You still beat a big turtle and save the princess. Now, everything in between is still that. Nothing has changed. But because of this feeling, because of this idea that the formula is completely different because it's in a 3D space, we give it more credit, I believe, than it's due. That's why it is usually thought of as the best, even though it was the first game on the console, is because, gotta catch my breath for a second. It's why it was thought of as the best, even though it was the first game on the console, because it was the first game of its kind. So even though it was using the oldest and most tried and true formula of Nintendo, it did one big thing differently. But when you look at Ocarina of Time objectively, and that's the point of this video, the point of this rant, and I know I've gone on for a while and I probably repeated myself quite a bit, but when you look at it objectively, every single detail in it meant more, changed more than just a few different styles of jumping changed in Mario from being made 3D. Mario 64 is the best Mario game on the N64, and therefore a lot of people think it's the best game on the N64. But that's because they have no comparison. Ocarina of Time is definitely the best game for the general public, I believe, on the N64, simply because if you include the people who would prefer it over Mario 64, but still actually like Majora's Mask more, then I believe it's actually a larger number of people. But that's my opinion. If you disagree with what I've said here and you'd like to talk about how Mario 64 innovated in ways other than just putting Mario in a 3D space, fighting all the same characters, doing all the same things, but now with a Z-axis, or if you'd like to talk about how Zelda didn't do anything new with the Z-axis, or you have more to expound upon in the same realms of the things that I've been saying, then go ahead and put that down below in the comments. Let me know what you think, because I am truly, honestly curious what you think. And I know that this has been rambly, and I probably retreaded a lot of the same space that I've already been talking about multiple times. But I didn't want to make a script or anything. I just wanted to talk to you. I wanted to have a conversation about this. So thank you all so much for being here. As always, this has been a lot of fun, and we will see you in the next one. And for now, this is Nathan Blake signing off for Nathanblakegames. Sayonara.